Well, thank you very much, Flora, for that. Obviously, I think at the last count we're talking about cherishing our differences. I think the last count we had something like 6,000 to 8,000 different kind of differences if you look at the kind of established rare diseases around Europe. So let's try and get some information. First of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to take part in this workshop and to present a short introduction about registries. Registries are becoming more and more important in rare diseases and in terms of both clinical research, management, social care. It's a very big subject. I will probably not do it justice within the time allocated, but I'll do my best anyway. Right, the contents. My presentation will be looking at these main areas. What are registries? Why are they beneficial to have? How and why could and should patient groups be involved in registries? And then I'm going to talk to you about RD Connect, which is a project I've been involved with for some time now. And I will explain a little bit more about this at the second part of my presentation. So what are registries? So patient registries are an ongoing exhaustive system of data collection which contains data from patients with the same diseases, but not necessarily with the same kind of subgroup within the disease. So there can be different cohorts, or it could be all included in one main registry. They are very thorough and very important in terms of effective research, in terms of creating infrastructures, and these registries are the tools that we require to collect data over a significant amount of time. And of course, a lot of human resources are involved in this collection, and also not only the collection, but actually in the analysis, in the structuring of the data, in order to make and get meaningful outcomes and information out of these registries. Also, it's important to have good financial sustainability, and a lot of investment is required in order to make these registries sustainable. Most of the registries are part of a collaborative effort, which is very important at both regional, national, international levels to establish, because you have all sorts of scales through which registries are gathered, and data in those registries can be from a simple registry or small database in a hospital, all the way up to an international or pan-European or global disease registry for patients. So just to give you a couple of definitions that have been used. So first of all, obviously the WHO, very important definition, and it's quite general and all-encompassing in some ways. I think what is important with this particular definition is that it does not prejudge the amount of collected data, which can be either minimal or very extensive or very comprehensive, but it simply implies and emphasizes the continuity as distinct from a cross-sectional survey. So registries are only one part of different kinds of surveys or studies which are either observational or non-observational, but definitely registries have got their own sort of area which can be very, very useful. What are different types of registries? And as I said, there are many of these registries, because obviously the data that is being collected can vary from place to place, from disease to disease, and it's actually at the core of a register are the aims for which the register itself has been created. So it could be as simple as description of the disease, i.e., what is the disease, what kind of progression, what are the symptoms, what are the phenotype, the genotypes. There is epidemiological research, such as the frequency, the prevalence in particular populations or geographical locations. Also, they're very important in terms of supporting preparatory work for patient recruitment towards clinical trials when there is research being undertaken through academic centers or for commercialization by pharmaceutical companies. So a lot of this information is very important because it will enable those stakeholders to take part and to assess the extent, the feasibility, the viability of research that needs to be carried out. It's also very important in terms of monitoring and surveillance of patient population in terms of the disease progression. For instance, to monitor the incidence of the prevalence, which I referred also to the previous, the top bullet point for the description of the disease. So, but this is more especially in relation to an early warning of increases in the actual disease. So where you have an incidence or a prevalence that is expected to be stable over the long term, then it's very important to see if you have a blip because something has changed, something is happening, and the registry will be better suited to show that, to demonstrate that, compared to an ad hoc study, which might be more cost effective, but also the registry will probably be longer term, more cost effective in terms of the outputs that you can have. It will provide us. So for rare diseases more specifically, a register and an ad hoc study are effectively sometimes can be very similar because they both need a long-term time to collect the data and to have follow-up, and therefore it's very important to establish a precise incidence and prevalence over that duration, or to look for differences amongst different populations with the same disease. Also, as you say there, it's about establishing the natural history of the disease and the progression of the disease, and to document the natural and the meaning of the characteristics, what are the symptoms, how they proliferate, what happens to the symptoms over a longer period of time as patients and subjects become older, and also to compare outcomes with or without treatment. So they can be used as a control group as well as a group where patients are receiving some sort of treatment or the usual standard of care. So mainly for for rare diseases which are mainly of genetic origin, the purpose might also be to establish a genotype-phenotype correlation so that you can actually track differences in phenotype, i.e. in terms of symptoms and the presentation of the patient relevant to the genotype that they have. In many conditions such as my own thalassemia, we have a lot of genotypes and we have something like above more than 200 mutations, different mutations which affect the phenotype and the severity of the disease. Also you have monitoring and evaluation. This is also very important. The monitoring obviously in terms of safety, in terms of pharmacovigilance, in terms of these long-term conditions which might show up some problems in terms of something that is happening that wasn't there before. Also in terms of the evaluation, this is something that is very important as well because we need to know when we have a treatment that the treatment is actually doing what it says on the box. So is it actually hitting the endpoints that it was licensed for? And also, as the disease progresses, does the effect of the treatment decline or remain stable? One other issue which is also very important for most of our rare diseases is that a lot of these effectiveness measurements and registries dealing with effectiveness and safety are very much very important for regulators, but also for reimbursement authorities, because when a payer such as NHS England or maybe an HTA authority like NICE undertake analysis or cost effectiveness analysis and appraisal, they need to be able to know that if they have only a decision to make based on short-term data, that longer term there will be a tracking of what the actual medication is doing or the product is doing, so that they will justify the cost, and the cost effectiveness will be assured. This is also very important in terms of clinical effectiveness, and also it helps measuring the quality of care that patients receive, whether the patients are receiving a treatment specific for their condition, or a curative therapy maybe, now that a lot of gene therapies and advanced therapies are coming through, but also the patients who have not got a curative therapy perhaps, but are maintained on a standard of care, which is a routine established treatments. So other types of registries are, as I said, genetic mutations database in terms of tracking, in terms of new people being added to these databases that we didn't know about before as they become diagnosed. We mentioned healthcare and social services planning, and then generally you can have a variety of other databases which might not be registries per se, but will include from a small scale inside the hospital, ad hoc surveys, observational studies, repositories of cases, or things that are reported either through the research or the clinical networks. So, the type of data used in registries can be quite varied. A lot of it is actual personal data, genetic data, clinical data in terms of the background, the history of treatment of the patient, the kind of medications that would be included, maybe family medical history, whether the patient has been involved in any clinical research or has actually donated some samples, biological samples in tissue banks or biobanks. And ultimately, a lot of this data, because of the privacy and confidentiality issues, will be anonymized, so it will not be held in, by identifying the individual patient, but the identification will happen with various mechanisms. I mean, without going into a lot of detail about this. So the patient will not be readily identified by those who will be using the registry or looking at the registry. Unless there is, of course, an absolute necessity for this particular patient to be recontacted, in which case there are methods that this can be achieved. So in terms of who are the users of the registered data, I mean, it could be a variety of authorities, institutions, and obviously companies in terms of doing clinical trials and research, going towards licensing or maybe post-licensing for follow-up studies. And then, of course, patient organizations, they can use that because for them it's a way to track about what's happening with the patient group, the population, and also the disease. However, given the state of our European Union and the differences between legislations in member states, the accessibility of these data is a very different thing, because you have to remember each registry has got to comply to the local legislative framework. So in terms of who has access to that will be very, very different from state to state within at least the EU. So why is it useful to have registries for rare disease patients? Well, first of all, as we know, data for rare diseases is very scarce, and it's often underused. Even when it exists, it's underused and it's not linked up in any organized way. These are very important tools, and they have been recognized because they will support clinical innovation if you know what is happening with the patient population. Also, in order to develop clinical innovation, you need to do research, you need to do some sort of experimental studies initially, and to build up towards some sort of clinical readiness for trials. The collaboration of patients and patient organizations and clinical investigators is a very important matter, and for that for many rare diseases, patient registries are the only existing sources of information that in many cases have been painstakingly collected and that will provide the necessary information about areas such as natural history, the symptoms, the profile, the patient. Also, very important is the impact on the quality of life of the patient with that particular condition, which is also very important in terms of later on in terms of reimbursement and access. Also, for rare diseases, when a registry exists, there is evidence about the quality of care and the life expectancy and how that improves. But also, we need to be able to have that knowledge in order to be able to say that given a certain set of changes maybe in some sort of therapy or medication or some new product becoming available that will support the existing standard of care, that this product has actually made a difference, small, medium or big, in the actual longevity, the life expectancy, the quality of life. For instance, changing a therapy from an infusion-based therapy to something that you can take orally, or something that has a particular beneficial effect in some sort of subsystem of the patient for that disease. But there are some related issues for registries and for biological resources repositories and databases. In many areas, registries and biobanks are very closely interlinked, because when you donate or a patient donates part of a tissue sample, such as blood or part of a culture or whatever, to a biobank, that has got to be linked to a database that will have connect with the patient information, the epidemiology, the background of the patient, etc., etc. So, although biobanks and registries are pretty much aiming towards the same area and the same objective, because they look towards clinical research eventually, they are actually having a different way in terms of achieving that, and the methods sometimes might be varied. So on top of this, many of you will probably have been involved or might know or have read about the upcoming European reference networks, which are basically a network of centers of excellence for particular conditions that have been designated, and I think the process is just finishing this month by the European Commission, whereby a lot of the patients can actually be treated in centers of excellence, or can be linked from their center, if their center is not a center of excellence, can be linked to a center of excellence. So a lot of this information from registries will be crucial in terms of gearing up for this kind of network, both at the national and European level. Also, we talked about drug development, clinical trials, regulatory affairs are very important in terms of having the information contained in registries, and also the aspect of international collaboration, whereby registries become not only regional, national, pan-European, and nowadays when I speak to you about RD Connect, you will see that we're talking about a global network of patient registries. And we're talking actually about a platform rather than individualized registries. I've sort of referred to this about the need to have registries for the underused evidence and the centralized. Why should patients be involved in registries? Well, patient groups are very capable, and they of course they want and are capable of being involved. And I think we're going to hear some, stories about achieving, creation of registries by patient organizations, driven by the patient organizations, and they can contribute to a number of these areas. which are also very much part of the work that patient organizations do. Also, the patient organizations are able to link up to clinicians and researchers in order to encourage a better and more robust collection of data and to drive the research and the clinical innovation process. Also, to identify what are the kind of data that are important to patients, because each of the stakeholders have got their own point of view, and it's very important that the patient point of view is also included in these registries. And by this communication and this interaction, they can actually influence and involve, get the right kind of data in that registry. Furthermore, it's also about of recruiting and supporting recruitment of patients into those registries and then eventually, hopefully, into trials. And you know, the involvement of patients in registries can be at all levels. It can be at as early as at the initial level in terms of development and the management and the maintenance of registries. Of course, this will depend on the legislative framework and what is allowed by the national the laws in terms of privacy and data confidentiality. In terms of all of that, so the registries and the patients can best represent the patients' needs, as we discussed. They can increase awareness amongst all the stakeholders, including their own population, and to improve the quality and quantity of data that's been collected. So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about RD Connect. RD Connect is the main project. That is an FP7 project that is currently in its third year into fourth year now. And also RD Connect is connected with these two other projects, which they call the B projects, which are the European Renal Genomics Project and the Neurological Neuromics. And these are projects that have already got registries and biobanks and samples collected, and which will eventually start feeding in the data to the platform that RD Connect is going to put together, or is already putting together. We all have. Right, so just a very quick look in terms of the objectives. As I said, it became operational in November of 2012, and its objectives are basically aiming to develop an integrated platform to connect databases, registries, biobanks, clinical bioinformatics for rare disease research, and also to contribute to the International Rare Disease Research Consortium, the objectives of which is delivering 200 new therapies for rare diseases, and obviously the means to diagnose most of the rare diseases by the year 2020. When I last checked in the preparation for this presentation, the consortium was around 185, 186 diseases that they have actually achieved until at the moment. So what is an integrated platform? Just a little bit of explanation about that. This is supposed to be a collection of data from what they call omics experiments, so genomics, but all sorts of different subtypes of genomics, which are combined with detailed phenotypic data, so that you can get the genotype-phenotype correlation, and therefore you can track and diagnose patients that potentially have no diagnosis or don't actually know exactly the kind of genetic mutation or genetic information or severity of their condition through this interaction, because this will be available and linked to different research teams around the world, and eventually that would drive increased rates of diagnosis, increased rates of curative, and will drive also increased cases of new technologies, new therapies coming through. So all of that information and the availability of biomaterial will be made accessible online through interactive interfaces, adequately safeguarded and protected, obviously for data protection purposes. So far the work has been focused mainly on setting up the infrastructure, making sure that it works, and then slowly adding on various other modules to that main baseline platform. And the start of this has been actually getting in the data from the 2B projects, and also to generate now the additional IRDIC projects that are generating additional genomic data, which will eventually be linked to the RD Connect platform. So the structure, as I mentioned there, is also that from the beginning, neuromics and urenomics were going to be very crucial because they were the initiators of the data, of the beta testing, if you like, and then they will develop further on their own accord. Within RD Connect, the main package for databases and patient registries is Work Package 2. You can see the objectives on the screen. It's basically about harmonization and standardization of the databases, because you can imagine there's lots of different databases with different formats, with different organization structures and hierarchies, collecting and providing accurate and quality controlled patient data for natural history studies, so the long-term studies that are required, to identify study participation, and also to look at pharmacovigilance in terms of tracking safety across the years for specific therapies. And also to provide a number of stratified and well-characterized patients, even within the same condition, that will enable the concentration on specific types of, let's say, severity or specific types of genetic mutations that might have more special requirements in terms of their care, or in terms of the comparison with other sub-cohorts within the same disease population. So the activities have been centered until now on the identification and scoping of the international registries within Europe, the existing one, undertaking an extensive mapping exercise jointly with the biobanking work package to create a list of registries and biobanks that can be surveyed and can be sort of established within the platform. Develop, of course, best practice recommendations through this core implementation group. And also to start linking records of the same individual across the different modules, because we want to have an interlinked platform that will be able to give a sort of a harmonized approach to individual patients. This has been achieved through what they call a GUID, or a globally unique identifier, which is something that has been done in such a way that, if you remember when I talked earlier about anonymization, will not compromise safety, will not compromise confidentiality, but will allow a tracking mechanism to exist, which will be segregated from the main data that will be on the platform, so that if there is a need to recontact the patient backwards because something has been discovered or something significant is happening, then they can do that. In terms of governance, very quickly, the main areas where patient involvement has been very well established is Work Package 6, the ethical, legal, social impact issues, which you can understand is very important, especially for patients. And also Work Package 8, which is the package led by Eurordis, and involves the engagement and ensuring that all the work packages in the other parts of the platform of the project communicate with patients and feedback information and the wishes of patients. One of the very important information is that there was an international charter was created in terms of sharing, because sharing now happens across all jurisdictions, global jurisdictions, and because if you have European legislation is pretty much defined by European Union legislation. However, this creates a problem of what happens if you want to exchange data, share data with other jurisdictions like the US, South America, Brazil, for instance, China. These jurisdictions have got completely different legislation. And in the US, transparency and data security, not in terms of the data, but in terms of who has access to the data, is very different compared to Europe. So this international charter needed to be addressed as a way to mitigate and to ensure security for patients who want to be involved in this RD Connect project. In terms of governance, the involvement of patients, as Flora mentioned at the beginning, patients are involved in the two main patient advisory councils who feed back information into the management board and help with the decision making in terms of the issues that patients identify. The Patient Advisory Council, as well as the Rare Disease Patient and Ethics Council. So separate from our own work packages that I mentioned before, this is on top an extra layer of governance that we are participating in. They both have their own remits, which is up there, so I won't dwell on this. I'll try to move on a little bit. And again, I mentioned work package 6, which is the ethical or the LC work package. And the work that we have been undertaking for the last 3.5 years is about developing guidelines, a standard for informed consent. We had a very difficult time and very interesting time in terms of deciding what is the best option, which is the best model. Do we want a broad type of consent where you just sign and you agree your consent and then you pretty much forget about it because the clinicians and the research teams have got access, and you're basically implying that you don't want to have any further involvement once you've provided your sample, you've been included in the biobank and the registry, or you want a more dynamic consent where at certain points in time researchers come back to you and say, we're going to change a little bit, we're going to go into this kind of direction for our research because we think it's going to be interesting, are you happy, are you agreeing, etc. And so also about producing standards of protection for personal data that we mentioned before, and the guidelines for effective and ethical data and sample sharing. And finally, I think one of the main achievements has been the adoption, the creation and adoption and establishment of the International Charter for Sharing Biospecimens and Data. Just to clarify that when a patient provides samples and information, the people who receive that are not the owners, the patient remains the owner, and the research teams, etc., in the RD Connect are the custodians. And this is the established principle internationally, and within the charter that is reflected. And the main principles of respect for privacy and autonomy, reciprocity, freedom for scientific inquiry, attribution and respect for intellectual property have all been safeguarded. So that is really very quick trot about registries. These are my colleagues in the RD Connect pack, and without whom we wouldn't be able to do a lot of the work. They're also my very good friends. So I will finish here, and if you have questions, I don't know if you want to. Thank you.